So the Natlan arc of Genshin has come to an end, and boy was it an interesting time to be in the Genshin community. You see, there have been a loud group of people in the community who aren't entirely fond of Natlan, and will use any given excuse to hate on it. Even now with Nodcry being out, people online are still talking about how Natlan was the problem. But what about this region made it so off-putting for these players? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. Let me take you down a pretty turbulent retrospective of Genshin over the last year or so, and go over the reasons why it's not exactly a fan favourite nation. Disclaimer 1, this video is not spoiler free. Disclaimer 2, everything I'm about to say are not my personal complaints. Rather, it's things that I've seen being discussed online in the community. Let's cast our minds back to before Natlan came out. Now, before Natlan came out, it was pretty much a mystery of what it was going to be like. All we knew was that Natlan was the Nation of War, and as such, people were hyped to see what this Nation of War was going to look like. So when we got our first look at Natlan, and we were presented with cute Saurians, it gave the community whiplash. Basically, people were expecting Natlan to be more war-torn. People weren't expecting light-heartedness and bright colours and cute dinosaurs. And I think that first initial tone kind of ruined everything. Let's ease into this discussion and cast our minds back to one of the first and most persistent points of contention: Natlan's character designs. And before we get into Natlan specifically, it's important to note that this has been an issue in the community long before Natlan's arrival. It's just that the discussions around it severely ramped up during Natlan's time in the spotlight, and it's not random as to why either. Some early examples of character design discourse goes back to Inazuma, regarding characters like the Raiden Shogun and Yaimiko for being too sexualized for the roles that they're supposed to represent in Japanese culture. Further down the line, and this is where Natlan starts to get involved here a bit, Sumeru's designs also received major backlash. Sumeru is a region inspired by Middle Eastern and South Asian cultures, and as such, players were expecting more diversity in terms of skin tones. Instead, players complained that characters like Dea, Sino, and Candace were victims of whitewashing, even Al-Haytham to a certain extent. As a result, people in the community during this time resorted to saying things like, let's wait for Natlan for skin colour diversity, since people already knew that Natlan was going to be inspired by Latin American and West African/Nigerian cultures. So already, Natlan had the expectation in the player base for being the place with more skin colour diversity, and we all know how those expectations aged. But now, let's talk about Natlan specifically, because ever since the Natlan teaser trailer came out and the characters were announced, even before the region released, people already had a problem with the design direction of the playable cast. And let's get this out of the way, first and foremost, all the characters were given flack in the community for being too light, especially when you consider that everyone has Nightsoul marks, but you can hardly see them on the characters themselves, especially Mauvika. Anyway, onto individual character criticisms from the community. Let's start with Ororon, and how he got major backlash not only for his design, but also his name. There was a strong belief among many players that Ororon is based on Ororon, who is the deity of the Yoruba religion. In traditional Yoruba belief, Ororon is the creator of the universe, and is depicted with having dark skin. In Ororon's case, he is depicted as a lighter skinned character with almost emo anime aesthetics. As a result, his design was accused of being whitewashed, gross cultural appropriation, and disrespecting the Yoruba religion. In general, people weren't a fan of Chasca's design to begin with, mainly due to whatever the hell is going on with her pants. So people from the get-go were already calling her ugly. And another reason why Chasca didn't click with a bunch of people was due to how her crash out was handled in the Archon quest. You see, one of the most impactful moments for Chasca in the Archon quest revolved around the death of her sister, Koichi. Players found the execution of this scene to be cringeworthy. And to be honest, even if the execution did go slightly better, there is something to say about the way we didn't exactly interact with her too much during the Archon quest. The player didn't have enough time to connect with her deeper, making this scene feel kind of forced. Hate for Citlali shot up during an event where the Traveller was interacting with her, and in the eyes of many players, she was acting way too fanservice-y towards the Traveller. Now, while there have been characters in the past like Ayaka who hints at liking the Traveller more than most characters, Citlali's infatuation with the Traveller took that trope to a whole new level for Genshin standards, which was something that the player base wasn't used to. Varesa had also been a subject to criticism from the Genshin community since the beginning of her release, again due to fanservice. But unlike Citlali, where the fanservice was limited to just an event that we'll never see again, Varesa's is permanent. While some players made the argument that the way she fights is representative of a form of wrestling that originates from Mexico, other people didn't see it like that. Some people saw aspects of how she plays and thought it was too fanservice-y. Accompany that with aspects of her character trailer which made people feel uncomfortable. In parts, if you know you know, she was hated even before she got released. Xilonen, Kinich and Mauvika's points of contention in the community are pretty similar, and that's to do with their technological/modern motifs. Xilonen's DJ table was a prominent point of contention, which many players found jarringly futuristic and out of place in Teyvat. Her character trailer as well also raised quite a few eyebrows with how technologically advanced it seemed to be. Kinich was also given some flack because of his pixel art themed kits, which also seemed too modern and out of place in Genshin. Now we'll get to Mauvika in a minute because she arguably got it the worst out of 3, but in the eyes of these people who have problems with these sort of motifs, anything that isn't purely medieval shouldn't exist in Teyvat. They think that this is a medieval game rather than a fantasy game, since in the past, Genshin built itself through mythological and traditional motifs. So as a result, the existence of a DJ table or pixel art themed kits break their sense of immersion into Teyvat's world, and it makes it seem like they're cramming random ideas that don't fit into Teyvat into this region. In fact, people in the community were even speculating that Natlan could have been rewritten because of how random things like this seem to be. They theorised that because the nation was being rewritten, Hoyoverse had no idea what to do with Natlan, and therefore they were just throwing anything and everything into it. What do you think about this theory? But before going into anything else, I think it's important to quickly talk about the topic of Genshin's technological advancements in recent years and how it's caused kind of a split in the Genshin community. There are the players who we've just spoken about, who think that Genshin shouldn't lean into technological aspects, but there's a second group of players who are open to it for a range of reasons. For instance, since the beginning of the game, we've known how advanced Khaenri'ah was. Beyond that, we have things like Sumeru that had incredibly techie things like the Akasha, as well as the Scaramouche boss fight, which is a literal robot. Even Inazuma and A building the Raiden Shogun and Scaramouche that could be considered techie to a certain extent. Fontaine never got flack for its existence of robots and various playable characters having guns in their kits. And Notcry also seems to be quite techie, with the whole Fatui area and Aino building complex machinery like Inefa and the boss fight, but it seems like no one has a problem with it, whereas Mauvika still gets flack for having a motorbike. But let me know what you think about Genshin's technological advancements in the comments below and why you think Natlan gets flack for it. But for now, let's finally talk about Mauvika. Mauvika's design caused quite a bit of controversy. While a lot of players found her cool, others did not. Her biker-style outfit broke the immersion of the figure who's supposed to represent the nation of war. And on top of the already tense discussions in the community surrounding Natlan for being too modern, this aspect of the Archon's design and the fact that she had a motorbike only fueled the fire in that regard, since to a lot of people, the bike felt, again, out of place. Another, and perhaps an unfair point about Mauvika that's brought up, is that people see her as a Mary Sue. Now, what is a Mary Sue? The term Mary Sue is used to describe female characters who are portrayed as free of weakness or free of character flaws. A Mary Sue is also a character who the story revolves around for no apparent reason. Now, as for the point of the story revolving around her for no reason, Mary Sue is an incorrect term for Mauvika, since Mauvika is the nation's Archon. It makes sense for her to play a massive part in Natlan's story. But the point about her feeling like a flawless character stands strong, at least initially. In-game for Mauvika, the people of Natlan paint her as a courageous and strong, but also compassionate figure who's good at many things and is selfless. She's even willing to sacrifice herself for the greater good of her people. You see, every Archon so far, no matter how divine they seem to be, have had their shortcomings, like the Raiden Shogun's quite toxic pursuit of eternity, and Nahida's initial powerlessness, for example. Mauvika, in comparison on a base level, does seem like the template hero who doesn't have much of a personality outside of driving the plots. However, if you look a bit closer, you can see some of her flaws. The way she values others could be seen as a flaw itself, since it can be seen as a genuine personal struggle and even a mental health struggle. She appears to value others over herself a little too much, seeing as she was willing to sacrifice herself, even if that didn't permanently fix things for Natlan. Even in her story quest, she struggles to be vulnerable in front of others. What do you think about this whole Mary Sue debate about Mauvika? A big cause of contention in the Archon quest was the death of Capitano, although you'll find out that he's not actually dead if you watch my video on him. Among all the negative discourse online about Natlan and its characters, Capitano quickly became a fan favourite, and it's not just because people were thirsting over him, though there was that aspect too. What people really liked was what he stood for and why he was in Natlan. He was respected not only in the game, but also in the player base. And for him to go out the way he did rubbed people the wrong way. People were low-key expecting death from the Nation of War, but not in this way, and not with number one of the Fatui Harbingers at that. Also, the lack of Iansan's presence in the Archon quest took people off guard. Now, for context, Iansan was the character who represented Natlan in the Teyvat chapter storyline trailer. Everyone else in that trailer, from their respective regions, all played big roles in the Archon quest, and became central figures. While Iansan is also a central figure, she has the same problem that Chasca got, where it felt like we didn't connect with her as much as we should have. On top of her being a 4-star rather than a 5-star, this means that she didn't even get her own story quest, or hell, even a hangout quest. So the lack of Iansan content disappointed longtime fans who were looking forward to meeting her and getting to know her better. Now, let's talk about some of the gameplay gripes that people had with this cast. It's undebatable that Natlan spawned some of the best characters in the whole game, with some of them being meta not just in Natlan, but meta in the game as a whole. But the one thing people had a big issue with was how much Nightsoul was being forced onto the player in endgame content. And to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if this continued in Nodcry, since lunar reactions are probably going to get pushed in a similar way. But considering that this was something that Genshin hadn't pushed like this before prior to Natlan, it made the player base feel forced to pull for these characters to complete endgame content. Now pair that drama with this event exclusive name cards, yeah. For those of you who are unaware, I'm just going to play you the short that I made on it during that time. The newest Genshin event was pretty problematic, and here's why. In this event, you had to complete as many floors as you could based on the buffs that each level gave, with the grand rewards being this limited time Natlan themed name card. While this was a fun challenge for some people, many found this challenge to be near impossible, and as such, they weren't able to get the name card. Here's why. You see, the first and last levels locked certain buffs behind the Natlan Nightsoul mechanic, which is bad for people who don't have many Natlan characters. Even if your only Natlan character is Mauvika, who is among the top DPSs right now in the game, you would still struggle with it without her premium team, especially since Mauvika needs another Natlan character to get her burst up faster. And unless you had another highly invested top tier DPS for the other levels, you were still pretty much screwed. Is this a bad sign that Genshin will start locking events with limited name cards for people who have premium, highly invested characters? Comment down below whether you got the name card or not. And finally, this last point isn't actually Natlan's fault. Rather, Natlan here was a victim of very, very unfortunate timing. With that, let's quickly brush over the SAG Strikes, because while that wasn't Natlan's fault in the slightest, it did dampen the mood of the nation. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about everything that happened there, because there are channels out there and videos out there who've done a great job of recapping the main things, but I will say this: going through Natlan's Archon quest in real time and having no voice acting for the main characters made it harder to connect with these characters who were already dealing with backlash in their own ways. And again, not the fault of Natlan, it's just highly unfortunate and unlucky that this was happening at the same time as all this negative discourse about the nation and its characters. The strikes also meant that there was an added negative feeling overall online, which added to the already heavy atmosphere of Genshin discourse during this time. So TLDR, the community had a lot to say about Natlan, but that doesn't mean that the nation was all bad. People tend to forget that Natlan actually had its high points, and when it had its high points, those highs were indeed high, and I'm going to talk about those now. Not in detail though, because this video will get far too long, and it's already pretty long. Oh, and again, big spoiler warning, right here in fact. Take the Law of the Sky. The long-standing theory that the skies of Teyvat were fake actually turned out to hold some merit. We wouldn't have found that out if that wasn't for Natlan, and it made sense to have revealed it in Natlan, since Natlan was the nation before Nodcry, and Nodcry is the nation that focuses on the moons of Teyvat. It's just a nice transition, really. And while the playable character cast didn't get the representation that the player base would have liked to see, the NPC designs and the tribe designs actually do a pretty good job of that in their place. Speaking of background details, you really can't fault Natlan's music. It's genuinely up there when it comes to Genshin music, which already has a high standard. Genshin Tour 2026 when? I'm so excited to hear this live. Natlan's world quest can be argued to be top tier, especially the one where you blow up Teyvat. I just feel like the world building of these quests are super strong, and a nice touch was that at the peak of the final Archon quest in Natlan, if you did the character's tribal chronicled quests, your experience would change depending on what quest you did and didn't do. You'd get an extra cutscene depending on which quest you did, which I thought was incredibly charming and a great step in the right direction. It makes the lore of the main character cast seem relevant, and you feel a sense of reward when you see that the game actually acknowledged your efforts like that. And it seemed like Genshin took some notes on this, because they're starting to integrate character story quests within the Archon quests in Nodcry. This is great, and it gets rid of the issues that we had with Chasca and Iansan, for example, where we didn't feel as connected with her as much as other characters. Now we're going to feel connected with these new characters, and I feel like that's thanks to Natlan. And another main point of praise is the exploration in Natlan. These characters have top tier exploration mechanics, and the exploration itself as a nation wasn't as challenging when compared to previous nations that we've gone through. This was greatly appreciated throughout the community. Saurians, however, up for debate. I'm sure there are other points that I'm totally missing, so let me know what your favourite thing about Natlan was. So to conclude, was Natlan that bad? Well, it's not as bad as people online make it out to be. People's initial long-term expectations of Natlan, aka the Nation of War, and the expectations of a war-torn nation, as well as more diversity, and what Natlan turned out to be, gave people a sense of whiplash, and as such, people lashed out against it. However, there are things that Natlan did incredibly right, and it shows in the way that some of the things that were introduced in Natlan are being implemented into Nodcry. But I'd like to know your thoughts. That's all I got for you. If you made it to the end, comment a bird emoji to show your superiority. Don't forget to subscribe and follow my Instagram. Peace.